The SpaceX rocket that was to be used in Wednesday's historic launch was manufactured in a small community on the Texas coast. The town of Boca Chica is home to a launch facility for the aerospace company. SpaceX broke ground there in 2014. The move brought some economic development to the area, but it has also disrupted the lives of many. As Rachel Monro reports, residents say SpaceX is tearing their community apart. And Rachel joins me now. She's been covering this issue for Esquire. Rachel, thanks very much for being with us. Can you explain to us a little bit more about the history between SpaceX and this specific project?
Sure. So SpaceX came to Boca Chica because they had been operating out of these government sites like the Cape Canaveral, as we saw today. But when you operate out of a government site, there's a lot of regulation. Sometimes you have to wait in line. And that really slowed the process down. So they were looking for a place to build a private launch site where they could kind of act as they pleased, and settled on Boca Chica, which is at the very southernmost tip of Texas. But there were a few issues with that site. One being that it's essentially hemmed in on one side by a public beach, on another side by a federal wildlife refuge, and on another side by this small community, Boca Chica Village, which is occupied by a lot of retirees, low-income retirees, middle-income retirees living on fixed income. And SpaceX, when they first moved in there, said, don't worry, we can move in here, we'll all respect each other, we'll be good neighbors, we can build this launch site right next to you, and we'll all coexist. But recently it's become clear that that's not really what's happening, and that's sort of caused the conflict that has torn the community apart.
Well, SpaceX did buy residents' homes for 3 times the value. Did a lot of people you spoke with take the offer, and what were some of their reasons?
Yeah, and a number of folks did take that offer, which on the surface certainly sounds generous, 3 times the assessed value of your property. But one issue that people complained to me about was that SpaceX controlled those valuations, and many of the valuations were quite low. People's houses were being valued at like worth less than $50,000. So even with triple that valuation, people were telling me, look, I can't even find a fixer-upper. These are elderly people, many of them with health issues, and so it's tough for them to find another place. But like you said, I would say maybe at first half or so of the residents of this community took the offer, maybe just happy to have the money. And others also told me that this is like a very remote, beautiful wildlife area. There are a lot of migrating birds and sea turtles. People moved out there because it's quiet. There are more birds than people. And then suddenly they're living next to what is essentially like a big construction site with floodlights, 24/7 construction vehicles driving down the narrow roads, generators humming all night. And so the people who had moved out there for peace and quiet really didn't have that peace and quiet anymore. So some of them sold just because it was so disruptive living next to this rocket building facility.
So for those who decided to stay, are there any potential health or safety risks, and how has SpaceX addressed them?
I think that the risks are in some ways, the risks of the rocket exploding are low, but I think that there are certainly other concerns. There's certainly environmental concerns with this construction happening. This was initially intended to be a launch site where there would be 12 launches a year. Now SpaceX has changed its mind. It's sort of an experimental test site. So this is where they're experimenting, playing around, trying to figure things out. And one of their prototypes exploded in November. Another one just exploded back in March. So, they're pushing things to their limit, and sometimes that limit means like things blow up. So there certainly are concerns about living next to an industrial site where these kinds of experiments are happening at all hours of the night.
Well, can you talk a little more about the implications this situation might have on other potential projects?
Sure. I mean, I think what's interesting in what has happened here in Boca Chica is if you look at what SpaceX said when they came to town and got all this approval from the government, and what they're actually doing, it's it's pretty different. There's a pretty big difference. And so if this continues, I guess the message is essentially, if you have a company that moves to an area, makes a lot of promises about how they're going to respect the environmental regulations, respect the property rights of their neighbors, not take up more than their little footprint, and then they just go ahead and do whatever they want. That does seem to be, at least what people are telling me, what it feels like to live there, that this company has just moved in and done whatever it wants. And if that continues, I guess that sends a message to other companies that they can move somewhere, make lots of noble promises, and then just act as however they want and might not face consequences.
All right, Rachel Monro. Rachel, thanks very much for your time.
Sure, thank you.